Hello, and welcome to another interview with Benjamin Moss on critical thinking for the rest of us. Hello again, Ben.
Hi, how you doing today?
Doing well. So, we covered on the last time, we covered fallacies and biases and then tried to discuss ways of overcoming them. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity since this is such a tight grouped set of topics. It'd be a great opportunity to interview you and pick your brain, understanding, of course, that this is material pulled from a book and maybe, your thought on this has evolved over time. So the first question I wanted to ask you, and I'll preface it with a bit of a story, why focus on thinking poorly if critical thinking is meant to focus on thinking well? And why I'm asking this is I once had, when I was learning calculus, I had a mathematics teacher that actually tried to avoid talking about ways to do mathematics wrong because she believed that it would mentally prime you to make mathematical mistakes. So my question for you in summary is why focus on thinking poorly? How is that beneficial?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there are a couple ways we can answer this. First and foremost, when we study critical thinking, we're studying how to reason well. And we also have to understand the opposite, how to reason poorly. Because oftentimes we can be persuaded by reasons that seem initially persuasive, but are filled with problems, flaws, and arguments. These are what fallacies are. And oftentimes we might even like analyze this in terms of like rhetoric, ethos, pathos, and logos. Philosophy, especially through the study of critical thinking, is concerned with all of those areas, but really puts more emphasis on the logos part, on reasoning. And so when individuals are presented with fallacies, they may be persuaded. And they may be persuaded, for example, through ethos. They may, for instance, refer to one's character in the content of the argument or the authority of the individual. On the other hand, they may be persuaded through pathos, where they are persuaded through using emotion. And so the reason that philosophers in general are concerned about, spotting or identifying fallacies is because they want to be persuaded, but they need to have good reasons. And that's why logos places a priority here on our ability to determine what kinds of arguments are good arguments, namely they're valid and sound arguments.
So it's great you brought in the art of rhetoric and the ethos, pathos, and logos. Would you say, maybe this is a little too sharp, but would you say that philosophers, when they're looking at rhetoric, they think that the pathos part and maybe even the ethos part are forms of poor thinking? Then is the whole art there to try to sharpen the logos?
So one way to think about this is from a historical context. We think about, philosophers walking around ancient Greece in the marketplace, in the agora. They would often encounter these individuals called sophists. And sophists were, in a way, they're comparable to philosophers, but they were really just intellectuals who would often pay individuals for to speak well and to be articulate and often, learn how to persuade individuals. And these sophists were not necessarily concerned about what's true, but rather they were concerned about being able to persuade individuals. And because of that, they taught individuals how to speak eloquently, but this meant oftentimes that their arguments, when persuading individuals, they were filled with lots of fallacies, fallacies that might appeal to one's emotion or might appeal to certain kinds of sentiments. So I think philosophers in general are concerned about rational deliberation and specifically concerned with identifying these fallacies because the arguments that are presented by individuals who might be like sophists that are fallacious are invalid arguments. They don't preserve the truth. And I think that's the primary concern here is that, the conclusions themselves in fallacious arguments are not true and therefore have to be aware. I will say one thing about, the art and discipline of critical thinking is it's is very much focused on epistemology, right? It's based on the theory of knowledge and kind of the requirements for us to understand, certain kinds of arguments. The conclusions must necessarily follow from the premises of an argument. But in fallacious arguments, the conclusion does not necessarily follow, in part because, there are different kinds of fallacies. There are formal fallacies, informal fallacies. But this is a problem. Bringing this to the audience and kind of making it more relevant. I mean, we can think of fallacies as similar to, commercials that we see on TV, where oftentimes the commercial may try to persuade you to buy a certain product, but they might introduce a fallacy. This is a flaw in their reasoning and their argument. So I think we have to be aware of fallacies because we don't want to be persuaded by one who believes that they know what they're talking about. But in the reality is that they simply do not know.
So your response is the reason why logicians or philosophers did and do focus on teaching critical thinking by identifying uncritical thinking or the fallacies is simply because it's so ubiquitous?
I would say that fallacies are problems associated with reason in general. They're arguments that are presented, but they have deep flaws, and the reasoning itself is so flawed that we cannot accept their conclusion. And when you're studying critical thinking, we need to make sure that one is presenting an argument in a way that has good reasons, reasons that allow us to believe the conclusion. That's one of the most important aspects of critical thinking is ensuring that the conclusion follows, that we're making an inference from premises to conclusion. And if the premises are flawed, namely they use fallacies, then we cannot believe a conclusion.
That's something I tried to press when I was giving the lectures too, from the content that we came up with, is that we really are surrounded by, well, we'll connect it to the example you used, actually. We're surrounded by sophistry. And again, just reiterating, as you said, a sophist is someone that uses rhetoric and specious or false logic to influence, among other things, as you mentioned, right? You might appeal to a sense of duty or the emotions and things. And something I was trying to express to listeners was that there's sophistry everywhere. Sophistry in the form of politics, sophistry especially in the form of ads. So
yeah, I think, a really great example of this today are social media influencers. They're modern day sophists, because oftentimes they might think that they know what the good life is, or at least try to persuade you to subscribe to a certain way of life. Maybe by doing that and trying to use advertisements and to market their products. But I think we have to be very careful to we have to be skeptical and also not believe all the claims unless they're presenting good reasons for believing those claims. So I think this is, critical thinking can be seen as kind of an antidote for modern life, by allowing us to steer clear from, these kinds of fallacies. They really kind of poison the discourse today and prevent one from being able to pursue the truth correctly.
This is amazing. I've never made this connection, but so in case you didn't catch that, I think Ben just threw rocks at social media influencers a little bit and said that they're false philosophers. I think that's really great. It's a very interesting idea. It'd be fun to think through, is pick a couple of social media influencers and see, like, what are they trying to communicate, and is it valid or not? Are they trying to say, here's what the good life looks like? And
yeah, I think, they're very different than, the kinds of sophists that existed during ancient Greece, right? Where they're, scholars or paid teachers. I think the closest thing we'll get today are like, lawyers and even teachers to a certain respect can be seen as sophists. They're intellectuals who often are competent in speaking eloquently and want to teach individuals to persuade and get paid for doing that. Somebody like Socrates, who was a genuine philosopher, didn't get paid, and he was genuinely concerned about pursuing the truth, not, for, payment, but for its own merits. It was intrinsically valuable according to him. But like social media influencers often want to persuade individuals to, subscribe to their channels or get likes. And by doing that, they try to persuade individuals to pursue a certain kind of maybe lifestyle. Maybe they think, for example, that pursuing wealth is, the one way to live a good life. But by persuading you, you have to be critical of looking and evaluating their assumptions and their reasoning. That's essential.
I mean, it's actually a fascinating connection. This is why I love doing these interviews, because I never know what's going to happen. But the connection between influencing and sophistry, I can't think of a verb for sophistry, but I don't think I follow a lot of, well, I'm not really on social media anymore. I tried to like very intentionally abandon it because I recognized it was such a source of unhealth. But there's people that influence me, so I have to meditate on that. That's, thought provoking.
Yeah, it's like in their job description, right? They influence. And how do they influence? They try to persuade, they maybe try to appeal to individuals, maybe to buy a certain product or to live a certain lifestyle. There are all kinds of social media influencers out there, who have different jobs and different roles. Some might, for example, talk about the best way to be a parent. Others who are, anti-vax social media influencers, and then others who just simply want to show off their wealth and who are philanthropists, right? So I think, there it's very broad, but I think today a lot of individuals on social media will follow these folks in the attempt to understand what their persuasion is, and to kind of follow what they think of as being the good life.
Yeah, there's tons of different kinds of influencers. This is obviously true. But you can kind of get a sense of like the basic movements that kind of underpin all of them. And what you said, like what it's in their job description to influence. And of course, another thing that's in the job description or in a job description is the tools that you will use, And so something that a social media influencer seems to always use, of course, is, well, social media, right? And the way that they are able to influence, specifically in the 21st century or right now, is by producing addictive content. So, I mean, an influencer is literally, I mean, they're influential insofar as they create content that you have to scroll through, you have to touch, you have to come back to. And so part of their mission is to how do you say that? To make you addicted, really, to their content.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, you see all kinds of issues surrounding this, like clickbait, for example, is a good example of using kind of emotional language to persuade individuals. Looking at a thumbnail, for example, on YouTube, if you go on and delete your cookies and you go on right now, you'll see a lot of clickbait. And you'll see that, these influencers will use these images that may have nothing to do with the content to try to get you to click on it and become addicted to this, to get, and their goal is to get you to subscribe to their content, where you can continually find it addictive and interesting so they can make more money ultimately at the end of the day. But I think, a philosophical skeptic is going to realize that individuals like this are living maybe two lives, how they appear and how they often want to persuade and influence other individuals and kind of develop this persona on YouTube maybe or on social media, and their real life. So I think we have to be careful and not to tread into, this kind of territory where we are persuaded and we believe this kind of narrative. It's almost like a mythology that they're constructing about their identity. But we have to be kind of consciously aware of fallacies and from a certain kind of vantage point. We need to make sure that the speakers are persuading us, but they're using good reasons rather than trying to, let's say, appeal to our emotion, for instance, or to use ad hominems, or if they make an argument that they're not creating non sequiturs, for example.
Yeah, one last comment, because really this is really making me think, is something that I always find really, I don't know, maybe it's judgy of me, but I feel really sad is when I see people in public that are making a social media post of some kind, and they might not be influencers in that sense, but they're participating in the aesthetic of the social media influencer. And when the camera's on, when their phone's pointed at themselves, they're jubilant, they're dancing around, they're happy. But as soon as the camera cuts off, they kind of collapse, and then they're just staring at their phone like, did I perform? Did I do it? Did I achieve a good life? But it's so momentary that for a philosopher, it's like, that's not the good life at all. That's just pleasure. It's hedonism, maybe.
Yeah, that's an excellent observation. I think, really Socrates is like, the epistemic exemplar here. And his mission for philosophy was kind of to use philosophy as a therapy of the soul. He saw that philosophy, especially using reason and rational arguments, it would allow us to, understand the self. And that was a critical kind of aspect of his entire philosophical vision. And by seeking out others who proclaimed to know the good life, he was, very quick to dismiss them by using arguments, using the Socratic method, and fleshing out all of these fallacies in their reasoning to arrive at different conclusions about the good life. And so when you see somebody who's like a social media influencer in public, like, a dancer on TikTok, you see a lot of these individuals in public dancing and oftentimes harassing others around them, right? You're absolutely right. We only see one kind of snapshot of their life. I hear about a lot of social media influencers who have had other underlying mental health issues, for example. But in their video content that they create, we may not see that. It may not be that evident. So I think we have to be very skeptical about this kind of, artificial construction, this persona that these individuals have created, because that's ultimately what they've created. It's not who they truly are as a person. It's simply just, kind of how they want to present themselves publicly.
I think I'm going to assign myself, you, and everyone listening some homework. I think we all need to go back and watch the original Wizard of Oz and just meditate on this, because as you were speaking too, I was thinking about, being on the other side of someone that's creating content is you're pulling the curtain back when they turn the camera off, and you're like, wow, this isn't quite what you presented to me at all. Yeah, but I'm wondering because that was a very fun thing to think about. But, some wanted to critique Socrates as a sophist, and he was doing something different. He was a doctor or philosopher of the soul, which I think is a really beautiful thing to say, and I also think it's accurate. That actually kind of is another way of answering the question I asked you. By focusing on the fallacies and the biases, what we're doing is we're not focusing on thinking wrong as a way to avoid thinking wrong, but we're focusing on, or we're diagnosing thinking wrong so that we can heal it. Do you think that's a little bit more accurate?
Yeah, I think this kind of goes into meta-critical thinking to a certain respect, but I do think that, epistemology and, critical thinking more generally, one of the core kinds of approaches is rooted in kind of an ethical tradition that we have an ethical obligation to be clear thinkers, to engage in critical thinking, because it does play a certain role in helping us flourish, live us a good life where we can differentiate good arguments from bad arguments. So we're not easily persuaded by individuals within a society, and we can use reason as a guide to help us, to help us ultimately flourish and live a good life. For example, just going back to social media influencers, when we see them and when we're persuaded that they're living a good life, and we simply watch their content. I mean, we might strive, for example, to live that way, and that might internally make us miserable. And this is especially true when, we're being persuaded by fallacious arguments. We might be persuaded to go out to buy a certain product that we think is going to somehow make our lives better. And we might get disappointed when we're not actually, pursuing that the way we expect it to. And we set high expectations for ourselves. So I think, philosophy, especially through using reason and critical thinking, is essential for kind of healing the soul and helping us live a better life. Absolutely.
Next question I have for you, coming from this conversation, is something that we know and listeners that are deep in philosophy themselves, they'll know that there is a hyper focus on the function of man being to think and to think rationally. And so why do the philosophers, or why do we focus so much on reason as being the guiding light rather than, say, the emotions or ethical sensation or drive or sense of duty? Why do we focus on logic, especially seeing that even though we're typified as the thinking rational animal, we're actually pretty bad at it? You know, I mean, most of, I would say, I think it's okay to say that most of us are pretty bad. I'm not very good at it. There's a question in there. What do you think?
That's a really interesting one. So yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, cognitive psychologists know that humans are really poor reasoners. We are very biased, and when trying to engage in decision making, we often make very poor decisions, depending on the context. But I think what we have to realize is that, critical thinking is normative, very much like logic is normative, right? I mean, logic is the study of reasoning well. But then, of course, there may be, an anthropological fact that humans are poor reasoners. That doesn't mean we ought to strive to become better reasoners. So I think it is kind of idealized in the way that it should be, because we ought to become better reasoners by studying, the rules of logic, let's say, learning how to make better inferences. We can actually become better thinkers ourselves. In fact, there have been empirical studies that suggest that individuals who study critical thinking are more aware, especially if you, for example, train individuals to be more consciously aware of their own biases. They're less likely to engage in biased reasoning in certain contexts. So to answer your question, I really do think that logic and critical thinking play a certain role. And you're right. In Western philosophy in particular, there is kind of this maybe a reason bias, that reason is prioritized as being kind of the best way to understand the world. But I guess we have to think about, different philosophical understandings of this. Take Immanuel Kant, for example. Like he formulated in his Metaphysics of Morals a theory about this, and argued that individuals can be persuaded by emotions, and it certainly happens. But when they do so, they automatically lose their ability to be autonomous, rational agents. And for Kant, autonomy was central to his moral philosophy. And when, for example, when we appeal to emotion, right? When we're persuaded, we watch a commercial on TV, and we sympathize and we feel really bad, and we donate money to a charity, for example. When that happens, according to Kant, that strips us of our autonomy. Kant and a lot of Western philosophers think that we are reason-responsive creatures. Aristotle thought that, reason is something that is an essential property of being human, right? That we have this tool of using reason. And that is something that differentiates us from all other animals. So I think there is this assumption that reason can help guide us. Because if, for example, I guess there is this paradox, if you try to use a non-rational way to persuade, you could always use reason to show what's problematic with that method of persuasion. And that leads us to a paradox where we have to embrace reason.
The things that I'm seeing in that are piquing my interest, of course, and I think you're right about this, is when you teach critical thinking or you write a book on critical thinking, you are either transparently or not, you are taking a normative stance. You're teaching content, but you're also basically saying one ought to think like this. And I'm glad that you said that, because that is that's a hidden assumption that maybe we haven't made clear in this series, is that we ought to think like this. And if I remember correctly, in the first episode, something I tried to stress is like a simple definition of what critical thinking is. We're just going to call it thinking well. And so one might ask, like, sure, I accept as a description that humans think. All right, that's non-controversial, but that doesn't, you can't derive from that I ought to think well. You have to do a little bit more argumentation there. So, I mean, maybe kind of playing on the word to think well here and bringing it back to Socrates, maybe what we can say is what drives that normative arc in critical thinking is that thinking well is akin to thinking healthily, right? So why be ethical? Why think critically? Because that's the healthy thing to do. That's what a healthy soul or a healthy mind does. And this is what Socrates said. And health is an end in itself. You don't do it for anything else. So of course if you want to be healthy, if you want to thrive.
Yeah, I mean, when you were talking about this, it reminds me of like David Hume, for example, the is from ought. You cannot, and this is, a fallacy a lot of individuals will commit. Just because, I don't reason well in certain contexts doesn't mean I not ought to reason well, right? Can't derive that ought from an is in this case. So I think, there are two different kinds of propositions that have different content. And so, the study of reasoning is to teach individuals how to reason well. I mean, to think of it as a tool that individuals can or cannot use. And I think it's very useful, especially because we were talking about fallacies. If you are listening to political rhetoric, for example, and you can recognize fallacies, you can, I don't know, for example, you recognize a false dichotomy. That will help you kind of understand the speaker's argument better and to recognize that. That's a certain kind of clarity that's essential in today's world. And to really be autonomous, to make good decisions yourself, and to ultimately live a good life.
I didn't address it well. I don't feel like I addressed it well in the lectures, but what would you identify as the difference maker between what an informal fallacy is and what a cognitive bias is?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I think it might be useful to talk about the distinction between a formal fallacy versus informal fallacy. So formal fallacies are fallacies that affect the content of the structure of an argument. Okay. So oftentimes some people talk about it as a form, right? So it has to do with the kind of inference being made. On the other hand, informal fallacies are often fallacies that we can find within individual premises or conclusions. So they don't have anything to do with the actual structure of the argument or the logic of the argument, but rather they have to do with aspects or properties of arguments themselves. On the other hand, biases are quite different. Biases are, one way to think about them is that, we're evolutionarily hardwired to have certain kinds of ways of thinking about the world, in part because of the way that our mind is structured. And so, because of an evolutionary design, we as organisms need to survive, and we develop certain kinds of ways of thinking about the world. But those kinds of ways of thinking about the world are often distorted. They may, for example, because of their biases, they may, for example, lead us to certain kinds of conclusions from a distorted perspective. So in a way, they blur kind of our understanding, our perspective of the world itself, or understanding of reality.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm really glad that you identified the difference between formal and informal. I think that I spoke to that, but I'm not sure because I feel right now that you just finally clarified that for me, which, being the age I'm at, having studied this is a little embarrassing. But if you've ever wondered well, I guess maybe I'm making a poor inference here. You tell me, did you just identify not only the difference between formal and informal fallacies, so formal being focused purely on structure, informal on content? Is that the difference that also stands for formal and informal logic? Can I make that inference?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain way, I think the definition between formal and informal is kind of like, it's an artificial construction to a certain respect. Even talking about like informal reasoning, for example, and it runs into other problems down the road. But, just very simply, take, for example, there's a kind of valid argument form called modus ponens. And modus ponens is if A, then B, A, therefore B, right? That's the classic argument, valid inference. But a formal fallacy, for example, is called affirming the consequent. So this is if A, then B, B, therefore A. Okay, that inference is an invalid inference, right? That's what we call a formal fallacy. And by the way, this happens a lot. A lot of people incorrectly believe this, for instance. But take for example, here's an informal one, like ad hominem, right, where you attack a person's character rather than the content of their own argument, right? That kind of informal one, it has nothing to do with the structure of validity or kind of making that inference. So that's kind of where the distinction is. It's just like there are different kinds of fallacies. I'd say that informal ones are kind of if you're doing critical thinking, informal ones are a lot easier to spot than formal ones. Formal ones require kind of an understanding of maybe some logic or understanding the structure of valid argument inferences. But yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. So I'm curious, what, as an educator, what fallacy or bias do you see happening the most in your students' thinking? Or if or if you want to add to that, what do you see in your personal life that crops up the most? Just basically, what do you encounter the most, either as a teacher or as a fellow human?
That's interesting. I've never really thought about that. I can't tell you which one I think I've encountered the most. I just simply don't know. I mean, I do see fallacies all over the place. I think one that just for example, I'll give you some that I encounter a lot on kind of an everyday basis. Like I see false dichotomy, for example. I see that a lot that's offered. Or ad hominems are quite common too. I see red herrings. Slippery slope arguments, like I could go through a list. It's hard to say which one I see the most, but I do, unfortunately, I think that people do commit fallacies in their reasoning. And I see it a lot, especially, when reading the news, when I'm listening to arguments that politicians make, for example. I mean, you see these fallacies, they're very common. So I think it's important to be critical and to recognize and categorize these fallacies because they are invalid arguments when somebody commits a fallacy. And oftentimes, a lot of folks may not be aware of that and may think that argument is persuasive. And to me, that's deeply problematic.
Yeah, they're good signposts for almost completely saying that anything that follows from this argument is probably no good. Of course, you can't have not specious, but you can have spuriously accurate conclusions, right? You have like a bad premises, but the conclusion is still true. Now I'm fishing a little here, but I'm curious. So when you study and teach critical thinking and you read about it, like there's definitely like a typification of the fallacies and biases, and you know them, right? You got the no true Scotsman, the easy target. You get all these. Do you think that new kinds of fallacies and or biases can be identified, and could you identify new ones, or would you take a shot at saying, hey, this might be a new kind of fallacy or bias that we have today that Socrates didn't?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of new kinds of fallacies that occur, and that's a really interesting question because oftentimes if you identify flaws in reasoning and one way you can think about this and the way to identify new kind of patterns of reasoning is it's exactly that they're patterns. So oftentimes if you're in an echo chamber, for example, in social media, and you see kind of the same kind of rhetoric reoccurring where there are individuals who post talking points, and those talking points then are posted on another forum or another channel, you can often see that there are different kinds of fallacies in their reasoning when they continue to post the same talking points, for example. And the reasoning specifically is based on how they draw that conclusion from the kinds of inferences that they make. And the fallacies are often found in the premises of that reasoning. So yes, you can absolutely identify new kinds of fallacies. And I think, for me personally, I think there's a certain kind of intuition that I have when I encounter an argument. And I think to myself, well, that might not necessarily follow from the premises, right? I have to examine that argument. And I think it's that initial intuition that helps guide me to identify certain kinds of fallacies. And maybe those fallacies don't neatly fall under these categories that we've talked about before. And that can sometimes happen. But you can absolutely describe an argument as having certain kinds of fallacies if it's flawed, for example.
I'm going to use a bigger piece of bait now and go fishing again. So I'm curious, Ben, do you think that the incorrect or inappropriate, important qualifiers, use of AI would fall under a kind of fallacy or under a kind of cognitive bias? Maybe that's not a good question because it's not very specific, but
Yeah, go ahead and elaborate on that question a little bit more.
yeah, let's say that if we're not already at that point, let's say we're at a point where, as educators, trying to teach critical thinking through specific kinds of content, such as applied ethics, which is what we're trying to do. And we have students that do sometimes inappropriately rely on AI, maybe to create a paper structure or an argument. Maybe we have a student that believes, like, say, oh, Professor Moss, I know that you corrected my paper and you said I wasn't thinking right like this, but like it told me this, and it's based on almost all of human knowledge, so it must be correct. Therefore, you must be wrong, Professor Moss. I was the one that used the tool. There's something wrong going there. Of course, assuming that the student is still wrong.
Yeah, so there are definitely fallacies that pertain to this subject that I think are really interesting. If a student is using AI to write a paper, for example, and LLMs are capable of hallucinating. They sometimes make up facts or what they think of being facts, but they're not. They're fictions that they're pulling out of thin air. That's a deep problem. And if people become too reliant on this tool and do not have the ability to think critically about the sources they're drawing from, or about the references, or even the information that they're drawing from, then that's like a kind of fallacy, especially if they use that argument. If somebody submits a paper to me and it's filled with AI written content, and the content is drawing from a hallucinated source, for example, then yeah, I think that would be something like a fallacy. Now, I thought you were going in a different direction when you addressed that, because I think there's this issue in academia right now about plagiarism, right? And if somebody submits an AI paper, they're often accused of they're plagiarizing the paper. Now, I believe that is a specific kind of fallacy that individuals are committing, because if you think that AI has a form of agency, and after all, plagiarism is defined often as, misappropriating a person's work without giving them credit, right? And the problem with that is that when you're having an LLM write something, there's no agent, there's no individual person. It's not a conscious being. So I think there are individuals who often inappropriately apply agency to something that's inanimate. That's a kind of anthropomorphic fallacy that you could say is being applied to that specific case of reasoning. And you do hear this a lot, unfortunately, in a lot of the discourse about the problems associated with AI. But I think we have to realize it's a tool that's used, and we can talk about this issue later. I know we're talking about fallacies, but it can be used appropriately or inappropriately.
Yeah, that's a good warning actually. And you're right about this. I mean, if you're in academia in any form or fashion, I'm sure that you've heard this idea that using AI is to plagiarize, and that in itself is a kind of fallacy, like a misappropriation or a misattribution of agency. That's also very thought-provoking, actually, because you wouldn't, for instance, misattribute agency to your word processor or your computer, even though you couldn't literally write your papers for school anymore in this day and age without them.
Yeah, I liken it to something like Gilbert Ryall's, category error, or category mistake. Gilbert Ryall, he gave this famous example to talk about the mind, and he said, well, if you're on a university campus, you might see different departments. You might see the philosophy department, the library, the gym, et cetera, et cetera. And you might be standing on campus and you're like, well, where's the library? I mean, where's the university? Well, you're on the university, but he's like, well, where is it? He thought that was kind of like trying to identify the mind. But you can make the same kind of argument about agency, right? Like when you're using an LLM to write a paper, you might be like, well, where is this personhood? You might be even referring to the LLM as a he or a she. And you might be attributing agency to it, maybe indirectly, by anthropomorphizing it. And so I think that's a kind of fallacy in itself, where individuals are often talking about it as if it's this being that's like a sentient being, kind of similar to the category mistake.
I think to conclude, the last question I want to ask you, hopefully you can give us some hope now. So the last lecture in this mini series on the fallacies and the biases was, well, how do we correct them? How do we heal them? Or how do we overcome them?
Yeah, sure. I think by training ourselves to be consciously aware of our reasoning is crucial. I'd argue that there's a kind of phenomenology surrounding critical thinking that's necessary in order to actually engage in it. You have to live by being skeptical, and being aware is first and foremost. For example, there's a lot of information that we encounter every single day, and there's so much that it's really just kind of overwhelming. And at times we can fly through the day without being aware. Sometimes we're mindless, right? So we have to be kind of mindful or aware and consciously trying to analyze, and have that kind of analytical mindset in the moment in order to be aware of these kinds of fallacies. And this means, for example, consciously, spending the time and effort to analyze arguments that we hear. For example, if you're watching the news, you might mindlessly scroll through articles on your phone, and you might not be fully aware of what's going on. But if you approach this from a critical thinking mindset, and you do so by being skeptical and not believing the claims that the author's making, while at the same time kind of bracketing that and analyzing the underlying assumptions that are being made. I think that's kind of the first step. Kind of taking this kind of making sure that you're consciously aware that you're avoiding, let's say, biases. You're aware of your biases and you avoid them. And you're also aware of fallacies and you're trying to avoid those as well. I think that's kind of a method to avoid these kinds of reasoning.
The art or the act or the practice of critical thinking is inherently ethical. It is a spiritual exercise, a la Foucault. It's something that we have to practice. And it does change, again, as you said, your phenomenal experience of the world. I mean, when this is something that's first and foremost for you, it is transformative. I mean, that's what the experience of pursuing the truth is. That's what philosophy has historically always been about, is the power and the transformation of pursuing the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to end by saying one thing about kind of how important critical thinking is and how we have kind of a ethical vision. Well, I think critical thinking kind of equips us with like technical skills, its really deeper purpose really is philosophical. It supports the pursuit of truth, such as the critique of ideas, and the cultivation of even intellectual virtues like humility, clarity, and courage. And critical thinking can ask us not whether our conclusions are necessarily convincing, but whether they are warranted. So I think that critical thinking, in a sense, is not just a way about reasoning, but it's also a moral commitment to reason itself.
That's our watchword for us listeners. And that's why you started the series off with the virtues, the things to be developed. Which again, I think was a very novel way of approaching the entire topic of critical thinking, because doesn't usually begin with with an ethical tinge like that. But it's neat to see this coming full circle, and we'll complete the circle in the lectures to come. But again, thank you so much, Ben, and stay tuned next time for critical thinking for the rest of us. Bye-bye.